In St. Dominic's Cemetery in Benicia, near San Francisco, is the memorial to Concepcion Arguello, also known as Concha and Conchita, also known as Sister Mary Dominica, the first native daughter of California to receive the habit of a nun. The story of why she did this, why she's buried here and not in Russia, is the story of a certain Russian count, and the theme of an elaborate musical that was previewed last July and will be the sensation of the fall season in Moscow if authorities permit it to open. Meet the Count, Nikolai Ryazanov, who in the year 1806 had some of the earliest and some of the steamiest Russian-American relations in history.
Западный берег Америки, богатейшая житница. Земной рай Испанской Калифорнии.
Hispansky, California, meaning Spanish California. That's where it all happened, in San Francisco to be exact. A true story written as a poem by the celebrated Andrei Voznesensky and set to music, rather daringly, by Alexei Rybnikov. This is Rybnikov's Russian Rock, in the scene where Count Ryazanov sets sail for California, raises the Imperial Russian flag, and adopts as his emblem the old Russian expression that means maybe, perhaps, God willing, the word avos. There's a second and totally different kind of music in Rybnikov's score, his love songs. At the governor's reception in San Francisco, Count Ryazanov, who is 40, falls in love with the governor's beautiful daughter Conchita, who unfortunately is only 16. In the first act, there is a moment when the stage goes dark. Ryazanov prays to the Holy Mother of Kazan, and she responds. This is the third theme in Rybnikov's music and the most controversial, religious. When the Holy Mother appears, the audience applauds. For the Lenin Komsomol Theater, these are unorthodox goings-on, more than just a rock opera, in the opinion of producer-director Mark Zaharov. No, he says, while he likes rock opera, he liked seeing Jesus Christ Superstar in London, he feels that to copy what's already been done by others is boring, uninteresting. Zaharov believes that with this production, he's created a new art form. His favorite moment is the seduction on his dark stage in the second act. The story of Conchita and the Count ends poignantly when he sails away before they can marry, and they never see each other again. But the show ends happily with a modern Hallelujah chorus. to lovers. That's the message. For today, this is Frank Bergholzer in Moscow.
Although the Soviet power was seized in the name of the people, for many years the people were not welcome inside the walls. But now, on an ordinary day, the public is permitted to visit some parts of the Kremlin.
19 years ago, NBC visited all of the Kremlin and filmed it all with the full cooperation of the Soviet leadership.
Welcome to the Kremlin.
Thank you, General Vidyanin.
Я очень рад, что мне представилась возможность показать.
The Kremlin has not changed a bit, but the welcome has. We, correspondents from the West, used to be in and out of the Kremlin all the time, by invitation. That doesn't happen anymore.
Да, Советский Союз разместил.
This is what passes for contact with the leadership these days, an occasional news conference with low-level or middle-level Soviet spokesmen. 20 years ago, Nikita Khrushchev was running the country, and we saw him often, especially at social functions, if not in the Kremlin, at embassy parties like this American Embassy 4th of July reception when Benny Goodman was a visitor. Brezhnev never does this. Khrushchev rejected what he called one pair of pants communism. Why, he asked, shouldn't communists also enjoy the good material things of life? He promised Russia would have them. He even tried importing Western miracles like American laundromats to enrich the Moscow scene. One measure of the quality of life is style. These are snapshots we took of Russian women in 1955. A decade later, in 1964, we recorded a day in the life of a fashion model, Lyuka Mironova, starting in the village where she lived. In 1964, this was the Central House of Models in Moscow where she worked. In 1981, this is still the Central House of Models. In 1964, this was the show, as Lyuka and the other models paraded on the columned runway. In 1981, this is the show, same columned runway. Different girls, of course, different fashions, a touch more style. The spectators of 17 years ago came with pencils and notepads because the fashions shown were for inspiration, not for sale. The spectators today still come with pencils and notepads because the fashions still are just for inspiration. In Moscow in the mid-60s, these perky felt hats were unbelievably popular. In Moscow in the early 80s, it's jeans and blouses, flashing thighs, bare shoulders. And for the men, instead of the baggy pants of 55, it's tight-fitting casual wear and handbags. 20 years ago, Moscow's traffic was made up of trucks and buses, taxicabs and official cars, very few private automobiles. 10 years ago, we did a photo essay on Super 8 film about a new car called the Zhiguli, built in a factory that Fiat of Italy set up for the Russians. The Zhiguli was to be the answer to the working man's impossible dream, a car of his own. And this year we could see in the streets of Moscow that for some the dream is indeed coming true. According to official statistics, 1 family in 12 now has its own car. There are other changes in Moscow. The newest apartment buildings are by architects who like curves instead of straight lines. Television has become a major part of daily life. The nightly news on television, called Vremya, is in some ways more important than the official newspapers Pravda and Izvestia.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи. На 2 миллионе гектаров ведут...
News is as tightly controlled as ever, but there are signs that a taste is being developed for news of what's really happening. That could bring profound change. There also are the trivial changes, looking back 20 years. We may never again be able to stroll along the Kremlin parapets. That's a change. There are two others. The trees are definitely taller. The girls are prettier and younger. Frank Bergholzer, NBC News, Moscow.
The acquisition is believed to be the largest single Arab investment in the United States. Pan American World Airways will cut fares on some of its London routes by as much as 59% starting November 1st. Last month, Pan Am set off a round of price cutting on domestic routes when it lowered fares within this country by up to 50%. Major banks across the country have reduced their prime lending rate by another half point to 19%. That's the prime's lowest level in 5 months. More than 60 years after the communist revolution, some private enterprise still survives in Russia, and with the blessing of the government. Frank Bergholzer reports from Moscow.
This fellow is a private butcher, works for himself. Someday, theoretically, in these private enterprise markets in Soviet Russia, the axe will fall. They won't be needed when the communist state can supply everybody's wants and needs. But that has not happened yet. So private farmers are encouraged to help the supply side and charge whatever prices the market will bear. A bit of Reagan economics, if you will, that provides an outlet for surplus purchasing power and provides an incentive to individuals like this gentleman who brought his tomatoes to Moscow from, where was that again? Baku. From Baku, way down yonder in Azerbaijan. He and his fellow entrepreneurs are selling them here for about $1.50 a pound, even though only 20 yards away there's a government-operated stand selling tomatoes for half the price. But look at their tomatoes. And that's the other side. Not only do private farmers have an incentive to grow an estimated 30% of the country's food, consumers have that marvelous luxury, a choice. But it's the private meat production that really interests the communist state. More than 15% of all meat produced. And what they grow, they sell. When they bring pork to market, they bring the whole hog. You can buy the head, the tail, and everything in between, except, as the saying goes, the squeal. Frank Bergholzer, NBC News in Moscow.
Willard Scott has the weather in a moment, and then Bryant Gumbel live from Houston's Astrodome. But first, a message.
The Soviet government, which does nearly everything here, does bread rather well. Bread shops in every neighborhood offer many sizes, shapes, and qualities of the staff of life, at prices which are held very low because bread production is heavily subsidized. The ritual of buying bread is very serious. Special utensils are provided with which to poke and push the bread to test it for freshness. Forks in some stores, spoons in others. The poster tells us that bread is not only the gift of nature, but the product of man's labor, and it should be treated with respect.
Уборки главной кормовой культуры кукурузы.
It's not just poetry to say bread must be treated with respect. The grain harvest this year in Soviet Russia has been less than the greatest. There was too much hot weather, even wildfires in some areas, then too much rain, with the result that this may turn out to be a disastrous third year in a row of substandard grain production. The Russian people have been told that bread prices will not be among those that are to be increased. But the Soviet public hears very little about how much grain from the United States is bought to make up for domestic inadequacies. And the fact is that grain shortages in Russia usually produce meat shortages, while the government breaks its back to keep bread plentiful. Well aware, no doubt, of philosopher Edmund Burke's warning about scarcity, that when the people look to the government for their bread, they will, if bread becomes scarce, turn and bite the hand that fed them. Frank Bergholzer, NBC News, Moscow.